Good morning, everyone. Good morning. It's just absolutely wonderful to see so many people here this morning with us. So thank you for your interest. For those who don't know me, I'm Sarah Wendt, and I'll be a bit of MC today, but also doing some presentations today. I'd like to welcome you all. I'm just going to get some quick formalities out of the road, and then I'm going to introduce Mickey O'Brien to do our welcome to country. Firstly, I also just want to acknowledge that when I look around the room, we have a lot of narrative invitational therapists in the room, so I want to particularly welcome you, and particularly the team from Uniting Communities who actually helped and enabled this research project to come to fruition. So let me just do some emergency exits. So in case of an emergency, a beep, beep, beep will sound. Please remain seated calmly in this room, and a fire warden will attend to us to assist us. Additionally, an audio message alert will be clearly communicated and heard in all areas of the function space. Should an evacuation be necessary, the fire warden will guide us all in a single file down the main stairwell that you probably walked up this morning. Also, just to let you know, restrooms are out of this room and down the corridor. So now that that's out of the road, it actually gives me great pleasure to introduce Mickey O'Brien to do the Welcome to Country. In actual fact, I've had the privilege of being present while Mickey's done 3 Welcome to Countries in the last 2 weeks, and so I'm absolutely privileged that he's here to do the Welcome for Country for this event. So I'm going to hand over to you, Mickey.
Tuwila Maniputnik Tuwila Wakinapatnik Nina Mani? Naitaya. So, Nai Gana Beka Manklankla, Marawachanga Gana Mina, Nai Nari Kamatpi Marija, Nai Wangadi Mani Budni, Gani Yatana, Indi Yata, Tendendanga, Karawirapara, Gariyata, Wadla, Wama. So welcome to the lands of the Kaurna people, or the Mena people, or the Adelaide Plains people. And also welcome to this special place being the dreaming place of the big red kangaroo. But we're also bordered by the emu and also the Kaurna shield itself. But when we do a welcome, we do say hello, and we do ask you to be well when you come to a place. But more importantly, we're saying, really, where have you been and what have you been doing? Because your face tells you where you've been and your heart tells you where to go. And our people, though we've been welcoming people for thousands of years to our nation, we've never told anybody to go home. And that's because we don't have a word for goodbye. But what's really important is our people have all been about sharing in culture, because no one person holds all the knowledge and wisdom in the world. And so I want to tell you a story, and hopefully it's a story that helps you resonate and connect particularly with today. Because as young people, we, and particularly as a man, we have this opportunity to sit with our elders, and particularly on this occasion, sitting with my nana, who would impart the knowledge and wisdom of our people. And on this particular occasion, was sitting with her like young people do. As she was imparting this knowledge and wisdom, I interrupted her. Now, she got upset and said the words tut, 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 and walked off. On the second occasion of meeting her and sitting with her again, I interrupted her to ask a question, and again she walked off saying those words tut, tut, tut. Now, on the third occasion of sitting with her, I listened to all of the information. Now, what did that do by listening to all of the information? Well, with inquiring ears, you get greater knowledge. So what does that mean? Well, we all have questions. But sometimes, if we wait long enough to receive all of the information, the answers to those questions are in the information. So therefore, we work out the answers to those questions, and therefore we have greater knowledge. Because in life sometimes it's very easy to ask questions and you get an answer, But do you know really the knowledge or the wisdom behind that answer, or is it just an answer? And so therefore it's deeper learning. And that's what life was about, is this deeper sense of learning, not always giving you the answers to everything, because in life we have to work out things. Excuse me. But more importantly, what was valuable about that, as a young person, particularly as a male person, it was very important to sit with our leaders, but more importantly, our female leaders, and being our nanas and aunties and those sorts of things, because by doing that, you have a deeper sense of value and respect. And they teach you how to have that love and affection and all of those things that are really important in growing up, not just only as a person, but somebody who then has that opportunity to care for others. And I think in life sometimes we've lost those connections. We don't spend those times with our nanas and aunties to learn those values. And I think then, sadly, as males, as we see, we overrepresent in these environments of violence, which is not great. And sadly, it's becoming a big issue. And if it was cultural days, well, sadly, people would be dealt with harshly in those particular methods. But today, we have this opportunity to learn and to educate, and I think that's what's really valuable about you coming here, and obviously to learn and to share, because when we do those things, I think it becomes a way that we all become accountable to each other. So I wish you well in this this event today, and I leave you these words, which is my nachi yokandaya, padmia do, which is saying you can walk, you can sit, but please observe and listen to the land. May you do it together as brothers and sisters, but may you realise that culture should never divide, but always bring us together, and that when you do those things, we truly become one people. And when we understand that we are one people, we then have greater value for each other. So, like I said at the beginning, I will never say goodbye, not because we just only have a word that doesn't say goodbye, it's only nakata, which is see you later, but because our people believe that we don't just become this person of the land, we become people of the spiritual as well. And so therefore, this holistic thing of our people is that when we leave this land, we return. We return as the animal, a place, a thing, because that's why we looked after the land, because we knew we had to come back. And so I may not see you in the physical, but maybe I see you in the spiritual. So Nechaya, Nakata, and thank you for having me, and I wish you well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mickey. Mickey's going to have to run because he's in demand. He's going to do another Welcome to Country for Remembrance Day. So thank you, Mickey. So I also, before we begin, I just want to also acknowledge the land that we meet on today is the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also want to particularly welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the room with us today, and I also want to acknowledge Aboriginal cultural authority in the room. I'm going to also now hand over to Heather Nancaro. It's an absolute privilege to have her here to welcome us to this event of ANROWS. I want to thank ANROWS again for enabling this research to happen and Uniting Communities for partnering with myself and my team. There'll be people in the room that know a lot about narrative and invitational therapy, and that's absolutely wonderful, and there'll be people that might not. And so today is for everyone to think about practice, what this practice offers, but also how we can use it in terms of engaging men who use violence. So everyone's welcome with your viewpoints this morning. So it gives me great pleasure. I'm going to hand over to Heather to do a welcome to this event, and then she's going to hand back to me. So thanks, Heather.
Thanks very much, Sarah. I too acknowledge that we're on the land of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains and pay respects to elders past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are present here today, and indeed acknowledge that wherever we live and work in Australia, we're on Aboriginal land, unceded land, and so I pay respects as a national research organisation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across this land in which we inhabit. So, Sarah, thank you very much for the introduction, and I'd like to, although he's gone, to thank Mickey for that very warm welcome and the pertinent message from culture about the importance of deep listening and listening to the women and the wisdom of the women in our lives. And I think that was a very fitting and pertinent way to begin the morning's proceedings. I just want to, if I could, ask for a show of hands from people in the room who are not so familiar with ANROWS, and just try to give us a bit of a benchmark. So, a few people not heard much about ANROWS. Okay, thank you for that. We've got some work to do, Michelle. Michelle Robinson is the Director, Evidence to Action at ANROWS, and some of you will have been in touch with Michelle already, so welcome, Michelle. And also Helen Soe is a senior project officer in Michelle's team at ANROWS. So I just want to introduce a couple of the ANROWS staff who are here today with me. So ANROWS was established under the National Plan to Reduce Violence Against Women and their Children, and our work is about building an evidence base to support policymakers and practitioners in the violence against women field. So we have, it's important that we fund and commission and undertake research to support the establishment or the building growth of an evidence base in our field. But what's more important in many ways is that we also have a very important role in transferring knowledge to policy and practice. And so that's why Michelle's job is called Director Evidence to Action, and we make it very clear for her and for others that that's what that role is about. There's no point having knowledge sitting on shelves, and I think that's one of the hallmarks of ANROWS and the vision of members of the National Council who came up with the idea. And here I'd like to acknowledge my friend and colleague Vanessa Swan, who was a member of the National Council to Reduce Violence Against Women and their Children, without which ANROWS wouldn't exist and this symposium wouldn't be happening today. So it goes back quite a way, the National Council back to 2008. But of course it took some time to, following that, the blueprint time for action for the National Plan, before we actually did have the Council of Australian Governments National Plan released in February 2011, and ANROWS commenced officially on the 1st of July 2013, and our first program of research was launched in October 2014. So we're only just 5 years out from the very commencement of our first program of research. So we're still quite a young organisation, and I think that's indicated by the number of people in the room who are still learning about who and what ANROWS is. So I guess, there are a range of programs that ANROWS has embarked on in terms of, the development of the evidence base. So we talk about our core grant research program, which is general research. We have the Perpetrator Intervention Research Stream, which is this project that we're discussing today. Sarah's research is one of 13 projects in the Perpetrator Intervention Research Stream, and it's the third to be released. So it's, again, emerging research out of that program. The 13 projects will all be completed by June next year, but so far we've only released 3 of the 13 projects, so there's some way to go. We also have, I wanted to mention that ANROWS is also, in its leadership role, undertaking or has embarked on the development of an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research stream. And the reason I want to mention that is because we're very aware of the importance of engaging with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities respectfully and that means to some extent doing the work differently than we do in our core research program. So, for example, we recognise data sovereignty and the importance of shared intellectual property with community or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And we want to be in a position where, rather than us going knocking on the doors of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities saying, we want to do this research and will you participate, we want to get to a position where those communities are coming knocking on our door saying, we've got some research that we want to do, can you help us? So we're wanting to really flip that around, and I think that the only way to do that is by building a relationship with communities and establishing trust as an organisation with those communities. So the reason I mention that is because we haven't got a lot of research in this stream, that is specific to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, although we do have one that's being led by Professor Marcia Langton in Victoria, and Marcia's leading 2 pieces of research for us currently, and one of them is in this perpetrator intervention research stream, looking at the supports in the legal system for men who use violence. So I think it's probably just to reflect on the fact that these 13 projects are, I suppose, really about foundational pieces in a very rapidly changing environment. So most of you in the room would be aware that whilst there have been perpetrator intervention programs in Australia since the probably early to mid 1980s, it's more recently there's been a proliferation, I guess, across the country of perpetrator programs. Some jurisdictions have only recently funded any at all. New South Wales in particular, which recently funded, I think probably about 3 years ago, $20 million worth of men's behaviour change programs, but really prior to that hadn't invested in perpetrator intervention programs at all in that jurisdiction. So there's a lot of growth and development and a lot of work to be done in terms of understanding, what we should be doing, where we should be going, what works for whom in particular contexts. So the program of research that we have provides, some analysis of various aspects of working with men and understanding, how we can do that work better. And this is a very important piece of that broader program of research in looking at how do we engage men, respectfully and sustainably, meaningfully in the work of men's behaviour change programs. So I wanted to thank Sarah and her team for undertaking that research. So I will acknowledge the members of the or affiliated institutions for the project, which is Professor Sarah Wendt, who you've met from Flinders University, Dr Kate Seymour from Flinders University, Dr Fiona Buchanan, University of South Australia, Chris Dolman, Emerging Minds Uniting and Communities, and Dr Natalie Greenland, University of South Australia and Uniting Communities. I'd want to thank also Uniting Communities for hosting us here at their venue today. We would have to say, as others or Sarah has already indicated, we're delighted by the response to the symposium. I believe that we have about 150 people registered, and we hope that the work to translate the research into policy and practice will continue from the discussions that we'll have today. Just before I go, I do want to give a plug for our biennial national conference, which will be held here in Adelaide from the 28th to the 30th of April next year. So I'm hoping that we'll get to meet again at the conference, if not prior to that. The call for proposals has just closed, and so the theme of the conference is evidence into action. So we're really now at a point where we're wanting to be able to demonstrate to our funders and to our stakeholders, which includes all of you, how the work that we've done to date has been translated into action, whether that's in policy or practice, and often both. Obviously they go hand in hand. So that's an opportunity for the stakeholders in policy making and practice to have put forward proposals for panels at the conference where they will be able to discuss the work. So we're looking for a conference that's really about a discussion of how evidence has been translated into practice, rather than lots of presentations of research as such, but looking at the other end. The full program will be published before the new year, and that we, as I said, hope to see you there. I think I just want to close by saying I wish you productive discussions today. Actually, I do also want to acknowledge, I've acknowledged Vanessa, but I also wanted to acknowledge the other members of the panel. So I think we've got Fiona Mort joining us on the policy panel. Is Fiona here yet? Oh, hi Fiona, hi. As well as, so Fiona and Vanessa will, facilitated by Sarah, engage in some discussion about policy implications, and then that will be followed by Chris Dolman and Regina Newchurch, again speaking about practice implications of the research, and again facilitated by Sarah. So as I said, best wishes for a productive discussion today, and I look forward to mingling with you and hearing more about your work. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Heather. What's the morning got in store for us? What I want to do for the next kind of 20 minutes is I'm going to give you an overview of this research project just as foundational knowledge, so that people know where it came from, what the main findings were. And then once I've done that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Kate Seymour, and she's going to also share with you a case study that we want to work through with you to allow people time to kind of digest and think about some of the ideas. And then, as Heather has also alluded to, after morning tea, then we're going to have kind of an in-conversation with policymakers and influencers in policy, and then an in-conversation with practitioners using these ideas. So I also just want to quickly acknowledge my colleagues. I couldn't have done this research by myself. So Kate Seymour, Fiona Buchanan, Chris Dolman and Natalie Greenland were wonderful to work with, so thank you. So this is what we want to do with you in the morning. I'm going to share with you how the project was actually conducted, really briefly. I don't want to use up too much time because it's in the report in detail. But I do just want to give an overview of the major findings so that people know just that as a piece of foundational research to begin discussions. And then Kate is going to work through with you a case study, so I'll leave that up to Kate to explain when we get there. Narrative practice, invitational practice. So this project, you'll notice when you read the report, we looked at narrative invitational ways of working. And so I just want to acknowledge that we looked at two kind of schools of thought that are epistemologically similar. And so when we think about narrative practice, what we're thinking about is that practice that engages with people by exploring the ways in which they make sense of their lives through stories. So the aim of narrative practice is to enable people to re-author their stories, and in doing so, enhance their sense of agency and capacity for change. Invitational practice seeks to engage men who use violence in an ethical journey towards respectful relationships, and encouraging them to develop their own practice of self-confrontation and helping them to discover their own capacities for respectful ways of being. And so in this project, we used those two ideas and want to acknowledge the founders of those ideas, Alan Jenkins and Michael White, and the Dulwich Centre colleagues. So in a sense, when you bring these ideas together, what they do is focus on men's particular stories and backgrounds rather than universally applicable generalisations. So they're very focused on particular stories and backgrounds of men. In this space, so I'm talking about men who use violence in intimate partner relationships. What these practices aim to do is seek to create change that is self-generated, that is personally meaningful, and therefore the assumption is if that resonates and sits with a man, it's therefore more likely to be sustainable long term. What these two practices aim to do is open up conversations through curious inquiry rather than shutting it down through confrontational approaches. So both these ways of practicing are very active, they're very curious, and they're very exploratory with a man. Having said that, both of these practices are upfront and they maintain an unrelenting focus on women's and children's safety, and the end game, they're always thinking about men's accountability and responsibility. So that definitely does not go out the window when working with men. Women's, children and safety are centred. What these two practices also do is they maintain a focus on social change. So they both kind of have a larger goal in terms of challenging socio-cultural understandings of the way we use violence and the way violence is perpetuated in society. So they maintain a focus on large social change, not just necessarily with an individual man, and recognising that violence is an expression of power relations and therefore is essentially political in nature. So they do have a socio-political epistemology and value-based underpinning these approaches. So what did we do? Our study had had aims and questions, which I'd quickly just want to go through with you. Because invitational narrative ways of working had kind of been described in a landmark piece of ANROWS around perpetrator programs as an emerging kind of practice when working with men, we wanted to have a real good look at it. And so our study sought to document how invitational and narrative approaches have been taken up in the field, specifically of domestic violence. We wanted to document the journey of engagement using these ideas, but from the viewpoints of the man, his partner or ex-partner and practitioners. And invitational narrative practice principles we wanted to document that enable behaviour and attitudinal change in men. So we wanted to have a real look at the practice principles that were being used to enable this. So there are some of our research questions. We really wanted to look at how these practice approaches work to engage men. So engagement is a big theme in this space, how you engage men to start looking at behavioural and attitudinal change. How do these ways of working understand, therefore, men's behaviour and attitudinal change? How do they actually promote women's safety and centre women's and children's safety? How do these ways of working support perpetrator accountability and responsibility? And what is it about these ways of working when used with perpetrators of domestic violence that work for whom and in what circumstances? So they were our driving questions. We had 2 stages to this study. Stage 1, what we really needed to do was get a real handle on the literature that already existed or some of the evidence of these ways of working empirically. So what was being researched about them and what was the effectiveness being talked about or the success of these. So we did a purposive literature review, and we wanted to do that because we wanted to extract key principles and skills of engagement embedded in these approaches. Okay, so we deliberately did that because we wanted to look at what was specific about the ways of working from an invitational narrative approach. When we started digging around in the literature, we also found that it's very hard to find studies that produce empirical research about effectiveness or success of invitational narrative ways of working. So what we did is we embarked on conversations with 7 key community informants in South Australia who knew a fair bit about the history of invitational narrative approaches in South Australia, and we talked to them about this and why that was. Stage 2, so you could say stage 1 is what we call in the research world deductive. We had to look at and see what was there to bring into the research. Second stage was very exploratory and inductive. And so what we wanted to do was enable practitioners, so practitioners who identified as being narrative or invitational in their ways of working, men who were using violence and their partners or ex-partners. And we wanted to enable these 3 stakeholders to talk about their experiences of invitational narrative practice. We had a total of 5 practitioners participate who had multiple clients. And so we ended up interviewing 11 men and 5 women ex-partners or partners that participated in in-depth face-to-face interviews. So we had a set of triads, so what we call the counsellor, the man and the partner or ex-partner be interviewed separately. And of course we respected that some women did not want to participate or were not in a part of that relationship anymore, and so we didn't want to bother them. So we had then another set of what we call dyads, the counsellor and the man that we interviewed. And in research world, we did a thematic and structural coding analysis to develop a commentary specifically around the key practice principles of narrative and invitational ways of working. So again, we were quite disciplined in trying to stay very focused on those key principles and ideas, because we didn't want it to turn into generic counselling or generic ideas. It was this approach that we were wanting to have a look at. So, how does invitational narrative practice engage with men? So what we found is that instead, what this approach actually does is it focuses straight up on the competency of men. Invitational practice and invitational narrative practice views men as inherently capable of engaging in conversations about cultural contexts, ideologies, personal choice and responsibility. So that was the first starting point, that men can change and that they can talk about their behaviour change. It also, this way of working, how do they engage with men? They often used or were concerned with ethics and ethical behaviour, emphasising men's own potential for ethical reflection and realisation. And this idea is central both to invitational narrative practice. What they then do is, once you've established engagement through being through competency and respect and engaging in conversations about ethical preferences, the next often step was this idea of restraining thoughts. So a focus on restraining ideas rather than the causes of violence or why men use violence further distinguishes invitational narrative practice from other individually focused interventions. And it is evident in the attention paid to what stops men from behaving respectfully. So what gets in the way of you reaching your ethical preferences? What are the restraining thoughts not allowing you to live the life that you want to live? The thought is then that when you explore restraining ideas, narrative invitational practitioners use this to open up a conversation about dominant, hegemonic forms of masculinity in a conversation about gender, power and control. So that's the way they started to open up those more socio-political ideas about gender power relations. So if you're kind of following me, we have respectful engagement, ethical preferences, what's stopping you from engaging in ethical preferences. And once you get a man to talk about that, that's when you can introduce ideas about power, control, gender, etc. The idea is then also that once you've established a man to be able to name and recognise those restraining ideas, it is much more likely to engage him to experience shame. And so shame can be very embarrassing. Often men leave when they feel shame. So the thought is, once you scaffold that and talk and engage men about restraining ideas, you're creating a safer space for him to sit with his shame and experience shame. And also then, once shame is experienced, it's much more likely for men to then be able to acknowledge the effect that their violence and abuse has on their partners and on their children. So conversations about shame are also seen as a key forum for men exploring their ethical preferences, which in invitational narrative practice are actually seen as the crucial foundations for behavioural change. So an emphasis on responsibility and change is central to these ways of working, and it's reflected in its overriding commitment to women and children's safety and its accountability to their perspectives and experiences. So the role of the practitioner in assisting men to develop competencies necessary to change their behaviour further emphasises the invitational narrative focus on active change all the time. So the change is forever evolving. There are moments of it. It's continually happening. Also, crucially, invitational narrative approaches are directed towards social transformation. So these ways of working are not just merely personal or individual change, but these ways of working introduce and pay attention to the structural and the socio-political context that shapes and transcends men's individual choices to use violence. And so an analysis of gender power, privilege and entitlement are also foundational to these approaches, but it is scaffolded towards the ends of the conversation, not at the beginning, so that you're able to enable that engagement so that a man is more likely to sit and continue to return and engage with those ideas. So what works for engagement? So this is what I've just gone through with you. These were the 5 key practice principles that we extracted, both in the literature and we found mirrored in the conversations with practitioners and also in the conversations with men who use violence. And so that's what I've just gone through with you. Respectful competence is one of the first ways to engage men through conversations of his ethical preferences. That then opens up conversations about what's restraining you to live the life that you want to live. Once you start enabling that in a socio-political context, you open up a safe space to explore shame with him. Once someone experiences shame, the assumption is that he's much more likely to have long, sustainable insight into the effect that he has on his partner and his children. There are some realisations of change and expressions of accountability that we wanted to also highlight. So what does expressions of change look like from a narrative therapist or invitational practice point of view? How do you know that these men are making those steps towards change? This is what we found that kind of gives moments of success or moments of change or insight. It's how men name abusive practices, especially when they can give specific details. So narrative invitational practitioners spend a lot of time with them to try and name the violence that they're using so that we move away from denial, minimisation, justification. Other evidence that you can see expressions of accountability is that men get to a point where they're actually able to understand, articulate and name the effect of their abuse on women and children. Especially when they can explain this in concrete terms, not wishy-washy. How men develop an attentiveness to other people's experiences rather than a self-focused stance on themselves. So they start to articulate seeing it from other people's points of view. They can name what that must have been like for his partner or what that must have been like for children to watch that or experience that. Other realisations or expressions of accountability is when men are able to engage with and talk about their shame and how they engage with men's use of violence against women in a more socio-political context. I have to say that is, we found, one of the hardest things to reach and it takes a very long time. So we interviewed some men around 2 years that they were undertaking narrative and invitational ways of working with counsellors, and that's when we only started to see kind of those snippets of that broader socio-political context or realisation of it. So I do just want to highlight that when we look at invitational narrative approaches, they aren't just focused on an individual man and his personal circumstances. That's how you work with the individual man, but they have a bigger value base, and that is around analysing gender-based power, privilege and entitlement. And so I did just want to highlight that again, that the ideas of ethical preferencing, restraining thoughts, or building that evidence of his moments of change is often done through this lens. It's the insight into this, so we're not letting go of this transformational social change. I also wanted to finish up before I hand over to Kate by also highlighting that narrative and invitational ways of working we found in the literature, and particularly through interviewing the practitioners, is that they have a very strong commitment to women's and children's safety. Also, we found that women's stories provide critical insight regarding men's change, what this looks like away from the counselling space and how it's experienced by others. And so while women's voices might be considered a crucial counterpoint to men's voices, therefore balancing it, in a sense, the intensive focus on men as the subjects of intervention, this is not to say that men's accounts are necessarily wrong or falsified. So we interviewed women not to try and trap men out or to think that they were lying. They experienced their moments of change, but we must always check in with women and children about that change. So rather, what is evident in the perspectives of women here is the incredibly complex and pervasive impact of living with violence, and that's what you see when you interview women about their experiences. You get real insight into the complexity of it and the impact that it has on women's and children's lives. When you see that and you listen to it from a woman's point of view, you get a real appreciation for the vastness of change that we're all embarking on with men, okay? So this is not easy. This does not happen overnight. When you see the complexity of violence, you're going to see the vastness and the slowness of change that is ahead. The women's accounts raise difficult questions regarding the meaning and the limits of change, particularly given the subtleties, the anomalies and the occasional contradictions that we still saw in men's stories. How do we determine, for example, what should be considered significant in change or sufficient in change? When is men's change too subtle, or when is it too slow? When is it significant? What is adequate enough in this regard? What counts as change? And so we still need to ask these questions, and we still need to engage women and their children about these questions. And so I wanted to also then finish there before I hand over to Kate to say that in any kind of intervention with men who use violence, it's women's narratives that also have to be very much a part of the conversations around men's behaviour and attitudinal change. So I'm going to leave it there because I want to hand over to Kate because in the next kind of 50 minutes, we want you to have a little bit of a think about some of these key principles that I've introduced you to this morning. But to be able to do that, often to see it in practice and to see it actually happening is when it starts to resonate with people. And so I'm going to hand over to Kate to talk that through with you. Yeah, so do you need the clicker? Yeah, so you just click on that one, Kate. Yeah.
Oh, gosh, so tall. G'day, everybody. I'm really nervous because I know there's so many people in this room that know a lot of shit. And I feel very, so don't jump on me, all right? Be kind. And to the woman who showed me where Uniting Communities was this morning, I saw her somewhere. I don't know. Anyway, I came out the car park completely lost, completely disoriented, and I was like, I don't even know what road I'm on. And I saw a woman walking along and I said, what road am I on? Where am I? And she said Franklin Street. And then later on I saw her checking in here. So to that woman, yes, I'm the dopey one who didn't know where she was. So good place to start. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just kind of we'll look at a case study and in some more detail, but basically what I'm wanting to do is to show some of what those ideas that Sarah talked about, what we saw in terms of how they looked in practice. So before we start that, so on your table you'll have a blue-fronted little thing, booklet. So that's the content that we'll be working through. But also you probably would have picked up the other little booklet that was by the door, which was white. It's called something like Research to Practice, yes. No, the other one, I think. Oh, yeah, maybe that one, yeah. So that's the actual principles that we're talking about today, so the ones that are outlined in there. So they're the two things to grab. But it's the blue-fronted one that you'll be working with a bit in a little while. So I wanted to start with, before we actually get into that, I wanted to start with a bit of a snapshot of an insight from one of the women that we interviewed. So this is a different case study to the one that we're looking at, but I just wanted to start with this because I think the woman here, Jerry, and partner Graham, but I spent a lot of time with Jerry and some of her insights I thought were really profound and kind of highlight the need for further research and further thinking about this. So it's kind of a bit beyond today, but I think it's really important to start with, to foreground that before we look in more detail at some of the men's and counsellor story. So what I really liked about what she had to say was the way that it highlighted how change can happen, but that, and she was able to talk about concrete change, but that nonetheless it was still an enormous legacy that would never probably never be gone. So she talked about that there's scars from stuff that's happened, and not just with myself. Like, I'm still dealing with the impact that this has had on my children, and I don't feel like I can speak to Graham about that because it's a bit blamey. So she's still looking after his feelings. I think he would just see it as a normal part. She cuts off, but I think she meant of parenting. He won't understand that, nor do I feel like I can tell him that this is, or I see it as a direct result of them being yelled at, blah, blah, blah. So basically what she's saying there is that the impact, and what she talked about more broadly, was the impact on her children. And in fact, what she went on to talk about was the way that her children, she had two teenage daughters, I think, who were very angry with her, not with their father, but with her, and the way that she had to live with that and try to navigate her way through that. And I think that's the kind of stuff that we don't necessarily see, because it doesn't necessarily be raised as a particular problem for a service, but that was a huge part of her experience that he just was not, he was oblivious to. And the extent to which she still looked after his feelings, Jerry talked about, I'm still not able to tell Graham the complete impact on me with certain situations. He feels like he doesn't need to hear it because he thinks that he understands it. So there's the constant tension between the work that is done in sessions, and there is concrete work and good significant work done, but that there's still a level at which I can't say that men will never understand that, but there's certainly a level of from the woman's perspective, a whole lot of stuff that just remains over time. So she talks about he gets depressed at times, and I don't want to be the one to push him over the edge, so she doesn't want to upset him, and she tries to pick her time, etc. But it's those same dynamics that are kind of at the core of domestic violence around whose feelings matter and that sort of stuff that remains. So even though she was very clear, she was able to recognise that and articulate that, she was still doing the emotional work around it. And so in terms of her feelings, she talked about putting those aside. Firstly, because if she responded to him in the same way, that, you know, they'd be living in a powder keg. But more importantly, she didn't know what to do with her feelings. So she was very able to talk with me about her anger and her resentment. But at home, you know, she just sort of had to manage that whatever way she could think of. But what was really interesting about her story, and probably resonates with people you may have seen, was the extent to which she was absolutely determined not to be identified or identify as in her words, an abused woman. So she was an amazingly tough, not tough, but inner tough woman, and she hadn't told anyone, basically because she didn't want to be seen as an abused woman. She didn't want to be seen as a victim, and that she'd maintained that over many years, and it wasn't likely to change. She didn't want to be judged. She didn't want people to be saying, oh, poor you. And she, you know, framed that in terms of I've made choices and I live with them. So it was logically correct, but the bottom line is that she was incredibly isolated because of that. So I think it's kind of the fallout of the growing awareness around domestic violence is that it becomes increasingly difficult for women to admit that they're in that situation because of, you know, what it might say about them. Absolutely not the way she should feel, but that was the way, you know, that was a really strong thing for her. And the bottom line is that she was incredibly isolated. So I just wanted to start with that because I want to honour her braveness in talking to me, but also of the other women who told similar things. Okay, so the case study we're looking at today is different couple to that one. So Tom, 50-year-old man, he was full-time employed in, I think, a trade that I can remember. He'd been married to Sandy for 25 years and they had 2 daughters. He'd gone to Uniting Communities over a period of approximately 2.5 years. Initially, he came to one-on-one counselling and then he moved on into the men's group. So for the men that we saw, most of them had actually been going to a rolling men's group, so one that didn't have a beginning and an end, but that they continued to attend consistently and then could return to if they wanted to, which is what he had done. But he'd initially, when he started off, he'd seen a counsellor one-on-one for, I don't know, half a dozen sessions. So this, he came to United Communities, after he assaulted Sandy. He broke her arm, and his 2 daughters witnessed that. But it became pretty clear that assault happened within the context of pretty much a marriage for 25 years or so of domestic violence. So Tom is who we're talking about. So just touching on the principles that are named in the white brochure, the key principles that kind of came out, and there could be many, there could be millions, and they all overlap, but we've just kind of nailed these for the sake of having some point to work through. So the first being around respectful collaboration, which is around, as Sarah talked about, seeing men as competent and capable, not prejudging, and being and what we observe to be a real curiosity in the way that counsellors talk to men about their lives and how they'd come to be where they were and that kind of stuff. And one of the, I don't know if it was Tom or another one of the men, but they used the term, when they were referring to these conversations, they talked about it as just kicking the ball backwards and forwards, which I kind of liked because it was that sort of a kind of mutual conversation that as we'll see, was nonetheless very meaningful and directed, but that it had the feeling to them of being a to and fro, which is a nice way to put it. So on your first page, there's at the top, a couple of sections from Tom, what he said. So one was around his one-on-one contact and the other was around the men's group. I'm not going to read everything because I'll bore you to death, but basically he's very much talking about it as a conversation. So I should start by saying we're hoping that this kind of gives you a picture of the kind of themes that came out. So in putting this case study together, I have kind of amalgamated a few of the men just to give you a sense of what were some important themes. So he talks about a conversation, he talks about not feeling interrogated, and that he liked the way that the conversations kind of branched off and then turned around and came back and would revisit a point. So, and for him that was really important because it was not non-confrontative, but it was also enabled him to make connections and things like that. He talked about it like so his analogy is, rather than hitting one path and running down a freeway, it was like a beehive, it was all over the place. So again, a nice metaphor. And then in terms of the men's group, he talked about the way the group worked, and that even though he was clear that they probably had some kind of model or program outline that they were working to, that he also had the sense that they were able to put that down and just run with the people in the room, which was really important. So that, again, that sort of cyclic conversation, but also that the in-depth, so being able to work in-depth and go beyond the surface. And, someone would make a flyaway comment and the next minute he said it'd be up on the whiteboard and they'd be pulling it apart. So the counsellor that we interviewed for in relation to Tom talked about narrative, respectful exploration, non-judgment, linking ideas together, but also touching on ethics and his own concerns. So trying to not give people the impression that they're being ganged up on, but also not being wishy-washy all over the shop either. Then Sandy captured it nicely when she said, coming home from men's group was always, Tom, would say, it's really interesting, I learned a lot about this tonight, and he talked to me about respect or communication or whatever the theme was, and he actually learnt stuff that I already know. He would talk to me as if somebody had taught him something and that he was interested in it, and inside I would be so frustrated thinking, I've been trying to tell you this shit for years. But I wasn't the person that needed to present it to him, and he had a lot of respect for the people running the course. So I guess, again, we can see that, just as the man is, making use of something and finding that useful, the woman is in the background going, for fuck's sake. And we can all imagine why that would be the case. Okay, is this the next one? Yes? Or am I out of order? Is it? Okay. All right, yes it is. Sorry, yep. Okay. So the one about ethical preferences, new realisations, etc., that Sarah talked about, this was one that was quite powerful in terms of it came through in the work from certainly the men's accounts, but that sense of there being something to work towards rather than just work over, the past over and over again. So thinking about the things that mattered to him, his core values, the kind of man he wanted to be, the kind of relationship he wanted to have, all that kind of stuff gave a focus for the conversations, created rich stories, but also it was important in terms of anchoring accountability to women in the sense that was the sort of point to come back to always was around how does this, whatever you're telling me, link with that aspiration that you've also talked about having. Tom talked about, I didn't want to be unhappy, you know what I mean? I want to be a better man, a better father, I want to live a good life and have a good life, and that's what I was hoping would be the end result. A lot of things I think I knew in my heart, but actually giving voice to them and bringing them to life made it a lot better. And for someone to say, it's okay, you're getting it, but I knew I had to fix myself because there was a serious problem with the way I was behaving, irrespective of whether Sandy was going to hang around or not. The behaviour was my behaviour and it was no one else's, so I had to fix my behaviour to be a better person. So we can see those kind of ideas there, that he's talking about the kind of person he wants to be, and that therefore that creates an internal sort of striving for something that he actually wants for himself, but also says something about how he's going to relate to others. And importantly there we can see that he's not, that it's moving away from I'm doing this to make her happy so that she'll take me back. It's much more around this is for me and this is around who I want to be as a person. So there's a clear shift in the kind of initial motivation. The practitioner, there's quite a long quote there and I won't go through it, but he talks about how there was, Tom was concerned about his own sense of himself as being what he called the pinnacle of the universe. So Tom himself was concerned about the way that he kind of saw himself as his needs as more important than anyone else's, and he was starting to recognise that and feel troubled by it. And so that gave them a focus to work from. And Sandy, some of what we could see from her as indications of change were that she talked about getting braver to tell him what's bothering her. And so she felt more able to say, you're pissing me off, I think you need to go for a walk or whatever. And that was a really profound representation of the bigger space that she had within which to occupy in the relationship. Yep. Okay. The other really critical idea was that's important to invitational narrative ways of working was that around restraints to change. So in short, what gets in the way? So if we've already established these are the kind of things that you think are important, these are the values that you have, these are the type of person you want to be, what is it that's stopping you from getting there? So it's again around trying to draw out that motivation in terms of not what's wrong with you or what makes you do this, but we know you want this, so what's stopping you from doing this? So it's again around that curiosity and questioning, but the questioning is very purposive in the sense of what's going on here, what's getting in the way, but what are the broader ideas that you might be buying into that perpetuate these ways of behaving even when they don't match with the way that you have said you want to be. So Tom talked about, you'd have moments of just pure shittiness that it's not right, where it should be better, it could be better, and I just couldn't work out how to get there. So just being like angry and being spoilt is probably a good way of putting it. Spoilt, so it's all about me. My philosophy used to be when when Sandy and I, Jane is also a pseudonym, it's just a different pseudonym. My philosophy used to be when Sandy and I would have a heated discussion, I'd always have to have the last say. Yeah, I just felt like I'd won because she's silent. Before that, it was just, I'm getting what I want, by stomping my feet and getting what I want, or dominating without really delving into, is this the way I should be going about it? So he was starting to recognise what was motivating him and what was the kind of beliefs and ideas that he was getting pulled into that took him down a different path. And the counsellor also, and I must say that across all of the triads and dyads that we looked at, there was a remarkable consistency between what the counsellor told us, what the man told us, and even to a large extent what women told us, although the extent might have been different, but there wasn't any, oh my God, well, he never said that. So on the whole, there was remarkable consistency, which is pretty amazing, really. So the practitioner said, acknowledged that Tom wanted to step away from this idea that he was the pinnacle of the universe again. He had this quite entitled space that he was starting to question whether he wanted to be in or not. And so he talked about externalising dominant ways of masculinity in our culture that support violence. And he also talks about how at a point in their contact that Tom had become very focused on the idea or the sense of, am I normal, or is there something wrong with me? There's kind of idea that he might have a spoiled identity or something that he couldn't be any different, basically. Can I be any different, or is this my lot, kind of thing? And so the counsellor approached that as a restraining idea, as something that was getting in the way of him being able to be different. And so that seemed to be a really powerful way of shifting in another direction that was more productive. Okay. So shame was the other really critical thing, and kind of logically follows, but the ability or the determination, I guess, of counsellors to really sit with shame for men was really important and really powerful. So the idea that shame is important, that we shouldn't try to save men from that it is uncomfortable and it is unpleasant and, all the rest, but that how important that is to actually being able to then make those other connections around effect on others and also ethical preferences around what does this say about who you really want to be. And so I think shame was really a really crucial part of this. So Tom talked about, I definitely felt ashamed and uncomfortable because I was owning up to myself. Because part and parcel of that is realising that you do have a problem and that, you're not as perfect as you'd like to think you are. And it's not a nice feeling. But if it was a great feeling, I wouldn't need to be there. Talking about Sandy's feelings and the girls' feelings and how my actions affect them, and going through all the stages of guilt and shame and remorse and, the things that you have to admit to, otherwise you can't move forward. If you think that you've done nothing wrong or you have no shame or guilt or remorse, then you've got nothing to be sorry for and it follows nothing to work on. And I won't go through the counsellors, but he talks a lot about his ways of thinking about and working with shame. So I'm hoping you will read these in detail. I just don't want to bore you anymore. Okay, naming violence, critical. So what is it you're doing? Let's call it what it is. So there was a big focus on getting into detail about the acts of violence in all their forms. So we're not just talking physical violence, but to be really get the man to be really specific and clear in naming acts of violence. So actually building detail about what that looked like, what was going on when that happened and that kind of stuff. So rather than a kind of a, eek, that's icky stuff, let's move away from that and talk about, your change, because that's more comfortable territory. It was around actually building detail about that in order to, connect with shame and effects of violence on others, etc. So Tom talked about one of the critical moments for him had been early in the men's group. They had a checklist of DV domestic and family violence related behaviours on a piece of paper, and part of the group was working through that. And that was, for whatever reason, and he'd probably seen that sheet of paper before, but for whatever reason at that point it connected with him, and he just experienced that as, you know, a huge moment. So he talked about there were 5 pages of it, of behaviours, and he went through and he was ticking almost all of them, basically. And he said, when you're ticking 80% of them, you've just got to go, holy crap, it's huge. And so then there's break, but he's talking about the hugeness of violence in his life here. Just little things like controlling a situation to get an outcome that I want. Like, you wouldn't think much of it, but when you persuade someone to change their point of view to get what you want, you're not listening and you're not understanding what's going on. Yeah, it goes back to even when we got married, I reckon. There were signs of it back then. When I really look back, if I want to look back deep, it's what I could get away with and how much I could pull back and then do it again and pull back. It was just constant. It's also about being able to name in concrete detail some of my own behaviours, like eyeballing someone and all that. This is quite... And the damage I think I've realised that I've caused. So despite what's going on now, that domestic violence imprint is still there, and it may not ever get back to the point where Sandy feels she could just say what she wants to physically say, because she might think something's going to happen. And she even says now, like, there's situations that crop up that she'll start crying. It's almost like a PTSD. She's just traumatised by it. I have tried just reassuring her, but it's already done. I can't stop what she's feeling from several years ago. So you can see there that he's actually really starting to grasp the kind of infinite effects, but also the infinite incidents in terms of tiny micro stuff around not hearing or speaking for, or etc. So he's actually been able to really demonstrate a move from thinking just about physical violence, so I broke her arm, to being, you know, much more complex and real than that. And Sandy also said, she said to me, I would say to Tom, I would be like, well, I'm broken. You fucking broke me, you bastard. So just deal with it. You're going to have to deal with this until I get better. So I really pushed him sometimes. I got really, really mean. So she was very clear that there'd been a particular period of time where she'd just been furious, and because I guess she felt a bit safer, she was able to really direct that at him and say, this is me, I'm furious, you know, about my kids, blah, 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 and that she was able to have the space to actually express that, and he talked about just kind of letting that happen, which I think was quite profound in terms of their background, was his ability to just sort of sit with that and not try and make it better in any way. I think that's it. Yes. Whew. So there was something I wanted to come back to. Oh, I should say for Tom that one of the critical issues that led him to United Communities was, first of all, at that incident, the police were involved, but also that his daughters had witnessed the event. So that was part of the shame, but it was a real kick up the butt to actually do something different about this. You know, after 25 years of just saying, oh, it's okay, it's fine, it's no big deal, that was a critical moment. So your job now, for whatever time, and I have no idea where we're at with time. Okay. Right, so you've got paper and pens on the table, the little pad. What we want you to do is just focus on these 4 questions with the accounts that you've got in the brochure, which is just what I've been through, but obviously I haven't read it all out. And we just want you to think a bit as a table, so you can think yourself or through discussion, but we want one response from the table. You don't all have to agree by any means, but just one piece of, well, you know, a number of, however many pieces of paper you want to have, but just to make some responses to these questions. So what stands out for you? What are you surprised by, or what's your first impression? What worries you or makes you feel uncomfortable about what you've read? What interests you or would you like to know more about? And what do you feel you learnt from Sandy's perspective? So you're probably thinking, oh my God, half an hour, that's ages. It probably isn't. And you probably will only scrape the surface. But So that's your job for the next little bit before you're allowed to have a coffee.
Conversation about, but also we wanted to talk about these ideas more broadly, and so for the next hour it gives me great pleasure to have a conversation with two significant policy influencers and then also two significant practitioners. So for the first half of this In Conversation, I welcome Executive Director Offender Development at the Department of Correctional Services, Vanessa Swan, and I also welcome Director of the Office for Women, Fiona Ward. So thank you very much for your time. So for the... I wanted to use this opportunity to have a conversation with both Fiona and Vanessa about, men's behaviour change, the men's intervention space, and how we think about that at a policy context, and what we need to consider when thinking about it at a policy context, not just at a practice context. I might just open up with you, Vanessa, if that's okay. If you could give us an overview of the programs offered for men who use violence in intimate partner relationships here in this state, or more broadly as well.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Can people hear me with my mic? Good. Yeah. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm on Dharma land and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. So my position is at the Department of Correctional Services, as Sarah said. So I'm going to speak about correctional services in the very far tertiary end of what we do in South Australia rather than more broadly. As people will know, that over the last probably 5 to 10 years there's been an enormous increase in incarceration rates broadly, and in fact in South Australia, and I'm going to look at some notes, so apologies for me looking down at times, but there's some figures I want to give you. So over the past 10 years, the national average growth in incarceration has been 47% across Australia. In South Australia, we've managed to have a percentage increase of 86%. So we incarcerate enormous numbers of people broadly. So this is not just about DV, this is about a whole range of different things. And people will note that some years ago we had a government that were very keen, and there's some memorable quotes in regard to Rackham, Packham and Stackham, which was really a direction policy-wise that South Australia has embarked upon. So it's important to know that that's the context. And we also have a particular and interesting experiment going on at the moment in South Australia, but more broadly, where the very good work that many of us, and probably all of you in this room, have participated in, which is raising the significance and importance of the issue of domestic and family violence, and really having a society that now acknowledges that as a problem and a serious issue that we must do something about to reduce. One of the impacts is that we have changed some laws, we've changed policing activity, and we have ended up incarcerating large numbers of people for domestic and family violence. Now, at this point, and I am going wide, we don't know with this experiment whether punitive incarceration in and of itself will reduce reoffence rates. And that would be just pointing, as all good research does, to research projects that may be worthy of doing in the future, is to look at what will the impact be of incarcerating men for offences associated with domestic violence. Will that reduce the rate of incarceration? Now, we have got some indicators around that, in that we know in terms of genital violence and other forms of violence that punitive incarceration in and of itself, so punishment in and of itself, does not reduce recidivism. We know that. That's factual. There's good, large quantitative studies that indicate that. However, if we then provide good rehabilitation, good methods of engaging people in other activities as well, in terms of, and I'll speak to general offending rather than DV, but For example, addressing homelessness, looking at vocational pathways, literacy and numeracy, addressing cognitive deficits. If we do some of that work as well as incarcerating people, we can reduce recidivism. So we know that. We also know from general violence programs, and these are programs that have very good international, quantitative, large population size, statistical validity, that certain forms of risk-need responsivity work, which is a particular form, not narrative, but other form of approach in CBT, will, particular groups with a particular intensity, will reduce recidivism for general offenders, right? We don't know that. We don't know that in regard to domestic and family violence. So again, I'm just pointing at areas that I think we need to be thinking about in this tertiary sector. And Fiona's going to talk about the more general sort of policy context, so go-to prevention and other sorts of issues that we must do. So I'm not trying to say that this work is more important than that work, because we're always, we have a limited dollar to spend on these things, so we have to work out what is best to do. But I will also say that incarceration is an incredibly expensive approach to dealing with problems. So in a high security environment, a person for a year costs about $100,000. If we then add on top of that the cost of courts, the cost of policing, the impact on families, it's a very, very expensive approach to dealing with this. And I remember many years ago, in my more naive days, working in the women's sector, in rape and sexual assault in particular, and I didn't think at that point, when my focus was victims, my solution was very much lock them up, put them away, stop them doing this harm. But what I've come to realise working in corrections is that that's not an end point. There's a tiny handful, probably under 10 people in South Australia, that we're never going to release. The rest of the population that we have there, we do release. So we release over, murder, maybe 20 years, domestic violence, maybe, I don't know, I'm guessing this, I don't know the data, but I'd say 2 to 3 years, but they come back very often. But it's not, it's not a final solution. It's not a solution. It's a costly, expensive way of continuously dealing with people. So back to programs, which is really your question, and I will perhaps try and be a bit shorter in my next sorry. So what we do have a domestic and family violence intervention program, and I want to acknowledge Greg Bullock, who's sitting over there, and Tony Fletcher and Alicia Sapota, who's over there. So we've got people who've actually, certainly Greg is the manager of the team that deliver this program in the community and in our prison system. So they know a whole lot more about this than me. So I'll look to them if I say things are incorrect. But at the moment, this program has been running since about 2016. Yes. So we developed this program, like all of us. We've got this group of people who commit these offences, and we need to do something about it. We feel as a society we should, and I certainly support that. And we're still trying to figure out, and this research that we're talking about today is part of that, what is the best approach to use that's going to be most effective. So in developing this program, the program's based on feminist principles. So the socio-political context of the narrative work that's been talked about today, it involves some narrative techniques and approaches. It also has elements of the Duluth approach, but not necessarily so much the very kind of punitive approach that some elements of Duluth talk about. It has some CBT techniques. It's 20 weeks. The four key principles of the approach is safety, accountability, responsibility, and respect. And we do this work in partnership with the Women's Safety Service South Australia, and Megan Hughes is over there and some other members of the Women's Safety Service, our partners in this. So we employ them to engage with the partners and ex-partners of the men that we're working with. So that's
thank you very much for that overview, Vanessa. It's important to hear it both at the tertiary end and also to continue to raise questions about what is the most appropriate response to men who use violence. It's a complex question to actually answer. But I do want to now turn to Fiona, because Fiona's Director for the Office for Women, And I particularly wanted to ask Fiona the question of why it's important that the department such as the Office for Women is actually included in broader decision making and planning around coaches or programs offered for men who use violence in their intimate partner relationships.
Thanks, Sarah. That's a big question. And also, I just want to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on Ghana land and pay my respects to elders past and present and commitment to emerging leaders and to work with them. In terms of I think it's when you talk about women's safety, when you talk about women's voices, then there's a natural place for the Office for Women to fit in that. I think the other aspect for us in South Australia is that we're actually the policy lead around violence against women work, so we coordinate and monitor the activities of all of our government departments, including my partner and colleague there, Vanessa's work in the Department for Correctional Services. But I think there's something more. I think it goes more to the question of the role of women's services more broadly, not just the Office for Women. Obviously, what's been touched on this morning is the important role of the victim/woman's experience, whether she's a current partner or an ex-partner. But there are women we know that actually don't want to participate. They just want to go on, get on with their lives and say bye. So therefore, how do you actually ensure that that voice, that perspective is brought in to the actual conversations? And, in my very early social work career, I'm not going to say how long ago it was, but it was a long time ago. Some of that was about recognising the men that use violence are incredibly often charismatic, manipulative. They've been using violence for a long time, so they've got a whole range of tactics. And sometimes there's the ability for workers who are working with men to see their truth as the only truth and operate from that. And unless we have that balancing in terms of the experience of their partners, their ex-partners, their community members, we won't actually know exactly where things are at and could be actually adding to the difficulties that a woman is experiencing. I think the other aspect is we know that men who use violence go on to repartner. So even if she is no longer in the picture, the woman that's actually been the reason for the engagement with a service or an intervention, we need to actually look at how we actually ensure that we're continuing to actually assess what's going on for other women in his life. So new partners often may not, the evidence suggests they're not aware of what's going on or what has gone on in the past. We certainly, as a South Australian government, have got a domestic violence disclosure scheme that is going through a trial to the middle of next year, which is the intent to actually provide an opportunity to gather information if women or family members or friends of women are unsure of what's going on and they're starting to see some concerning behaviours. And that's one of the very, there needs to be more mechanisms, but it's one mechanism to actually ascertain whether there's been a history and whether there's been past victims that he's partnered with. So I think there's a key role for women's services. I think the concern when programs started 20, 30 years ago was just working with the men, and I think the evidence and the research and the feedback from partners and a whole range of services, including practitioners such as yourself, was to say we need to have a very strong place for the voices of the victims, the voices of women, and to continue that voice throughout the intervention and also post the intervention. And therefore, in a policy setting, it's really important to have that women's policy voice throughout and to have the conversations that we have regularly about what does it mean for a woman whose partner or ex-partner is involved in an intervention. What does it mean, Vanessa's comments about the custodial setting and the incarceration rates. What does that mean for women and victims now and in the future? And, one example of that is the importance within that voice of Aboriginal women in terms of the incarceration rates. We know the massively over-representation of Aboriginal men, Aboriginal women in our prisons and in our custodial interventions. We need to look at that as a system to see what's actually happening, because it's not about them being Aboriginal. Something is actually in essence going awry in the way we're actually assessing things. And that was a very long-winded question. Answer to a question.
Yeah,
sorry.
and I think, Fiona, what you've particularly highlighted is, just some of those important points that when you have a practice approach like invitational or narrative ways of working who strive to capture the women's voice, you need to have that mirrored at a higher level in policy. And I think you pointed that out quite well in terms of how we might partner with agencies to enable that to happen, but also how you think about that more broadly at a government or a policy response about how you emanate the capturing of women's experiences at that policy level. And you can see that through examples like the funding of women's contact programs or the funding of a disclosure scheme. So I was kind of like taking those kind of points that you've summarised around, from your point of view, being the major considerations for your office or being an influencer in policy. I might then turn to Vanessa. Is there anything else that you wanted to add, Vanessa, about that conversation, but particularly, the major considerations for you in terms of investing in and funding programs that enable men's behaviour and attitudinal change?
So I think one of the issues which I mentioned before is cost. So the cost of programs and the cost to the community. If we spend money incarcerating men, then we're not, spending money on housing for homeless, we're not spending healthcare dollars. A society has a finite amount that is to be spent. And so I'm very mindful, and I think Fiona would agree, but that we're very mindful that we are trying to make the best decisions with a small bucket of money. And so I guess we're also, the detail's really critical, and we're still in such early days with domestic violence work with perpetrators, in that we don't, it's some of the detail that's really important. So, for example, with the 11 men in this study, some up to 2 years of one-to-one therapy. Now, that's not a model that we could use in corrections. It's just not. Like, it's the cost of that on top of incarceration, on top of all that we do. It's just not a viable model. So we really need to come back and go, well, and I'm very aware I'm using medical language because it's useful, but it's not because I think in those terms. But what is the dosage? What is at what point, how much is needed and what's the least amount that's effective? It's those kinds of questions that I think we really need to get to. Is it possible to do some of this in a group? What part can we do in a group? What part's one-to-one? If you talk in this model, there's quite an emphasis on engagement. Now, we know from broader work, not narrative work in particular, but broader work, that engagement of therapist or facilitator with the person is really absolutely critical in terms of change. And so we need to know what are the elements. So again, if I go to our general violence work, so we know in that work that for people who don't have a cognitive impairment, something like 9 months of about 3 sessions a week with some one-to-one sessions is the amount necessary to engage. If people have a cognitive impairment, that's 18 months, that's double that. So we know that that's the amount that will work. So we are, and again, this is not published, but something that I can speak about, but we're really critically, what we also know probably is another backdrop to this is something is not better than nothing, right? So we're in territory where there's risks. So there's some intervention that will cause more harm. So we can't just go, well, it's better than nothing, because we may be making it worse. So we have to know some of the outcome stuff to know. So examples of things that make it worse are boot camp. The notion, and again, people follow logic. So we're following logic. If it's socio-political and you do this, this makes sense, so this addresses the wider social. So that's a logic, but we've got to, and it kind of makes sense to me, that's my politic, but I'm a feminist, that's my politic, but we've got to know whether it works. We also know that, we know that certain sorts of interventions are harmful. We also know that some programs, if you only do half a program, people are more dangerous than if they did none. So we have, I don't know about this work, but we know that with other work. So we need to get into the detail of this in ways that we haven't as yet to know what is helpful. So we talk about in this work shame, and so people who demonstrate remorse and shame. Now there's interesting and controversial work in that space as well. So we know, for example, for general offenders, Shame, remorse is not an indication that they will be less likely to reoffend. That doesn't work like that. Now, we think it might in this space, but do we know that? So again, we need to, quantitative, let's see 5-year follow-ups. Who's doing less? Let's see this, let's know this. They're the questions that, for me, as someone looking to future programs. Now, having said that, we do have our programs because we think we can't not be part of this conversation. We are doing, because with our groups where we have got evidence about what works, the issue about what works is, are we doing it right, that we are getting the same results of the literature? We can't assume that how we do it is effective, given it's so precise. It's particular precision that's necessary to get those results. So we video sessions, we review them, we're doing up to 5-year follow-up of a matched control. We're doing risk assessments. What is the risk level? Compare someone who's high risk with someone else who's high risk who didn't get the program. Follow them for 5 years. Do large quantitative and figure out are our groups working. Now, we've got tentative good results for our general violence prevention programs up to 5 years post release. For our domestic and family violence, again, I have permission to talk about today, but it's still very much in-house work we're doing. We have some promising results for our matched group, but it's early stages and the numbers are too small to generalise. But we need to do that to then be able to demonstrate. So they're the kinds of things that are really important to me as a funder and a manager in this space.
Yeah, thank you, Vanessa, for that honesty. Also, and I think what you've also alluded to is that this space we're dealing with really complex issues, men's use of violence. And so when you've got that level of complexity, it kind of only makes sense that it's going to take a fair bit of long-term work. But also, I think what you've alluded to, and it is quite correct, that in this space we do need more research that looks at the longitudinal outcomes. I don't think we have that really well in Australia at the moment, so that ANROWS to be able to fund and start looking at this research is a good thing. So I'm just a little bit aware of time, and Vanessa's given us some insights about the possibilities but also the challenges of invitational and narrative ways of working. I'm just wondering also, Fiona, if you've got some reflections about, after listening today, about what possibilities invitational narrative have to offer, but also what worries you as Director for the Office for Women.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one of my concerns is that we don't go down a path that says this is the only way you do the work. People are unique, they've got different backgrounds and different histories, and what works for some is not going to work for everybody. And I think in terms of a research and an evidence base, we are still in the very early days in perpetrator work, but I think we're not necessarily always looking at who aren't we seeing, who aren't we engaging with. And, narrative, and, Sarah and I have had a conversation about this, narrative can be quite reliant on a cognitive reflection, linguistic ability, and therefore what does that mean for people with brain injury, from different cultural backgrounds, etc., where English isn't their first language, for example, are things that we need to consider. I think the other challenge for us is that, Vanessa alluded to it, that we're right in the eye of the storm in terms of the community's support and desire for greater investment in ending violence against women and their children. And in terms of our women's services, we've got quite robust and evidence, and certainly robust programs and connected and sort of a whole range and suite of interventions. In a perpetrator space, the predominant intervention still sits in the criminal justice system. And so part of the work of the office is looking at is trying to look at what do we need pre-statutory? What do we need? And moving past the primary prevention, there is an absolute role in primary prevention, and we need to build that capacity. But it's actually about that earlier intervention. I sort of describe it as a lot of and by intervention I mean more than just programs, and I think that's where we need to sit. The challenge for us is to not see it all as group programs or individual interventions. It's a broader suite that we need, and we need to be looking earlier. Now, you can look at the earlier being earlier in the cycle of use of violence, or earlier in the age, earlier in the trajectory of escalation, etc. And they're some of the things that we need to look at, and we need to build, certainly in South Australia, that earlier approach, which logic and cost imperatives and that may suggest you go down to look with younger men and look at what are the earlier interventions, what are the programs that need to be operating. We've done some work with our youth justice system to look at how we actually intervene, but that may not be the only way. We need to look at things. We don't necessarily have a robust understanding of what works there, and we're not, we've got individual amazing agencies doing work across the state, but we need to connect it up and we need to sort of facilitate it better. We also need to equip our first responders / earlier intervention services such as education, health, community services to identify a perpetrator, because that's not, we did that work 20 years ago now in terms of identifying victims, you know, various, you know, I'm looking at Fiona Buchanan now, who was certainly as part of that, you know, various mechanisms to have our health services identify, particularly in emergency. You know, this woman has had a history. We need to be doing some of that work in terms of this so we can pick up perpetrators of domestic violence much earlier, and we ensure that the interventions that then happens, whether it's to do with their mental health or drug and alcohol behaviour, are actually informed by the fact that they're a perpetrator and they're not actually doing things that could be dangerous to the safety of women and children. And we've had a coronial inquest here a number of years ago, White and White coronial inquest. If you want to go onto the coroner's website, you'll see that the Forensic Mental Health Services didn't view him as a perpetrator of DV. So therefore the practice then compromised, and whether that would have made a difference, we don't know, but certainly the suggestions from the recommendations are that understanding that he was a perpetrator, understanding that her having just given birth to a child is a significantly high-risk time may have resulted in him not being discharged to her home. So there's those sorts of things that I think. But we're right, everybody wants it all done. We haven't got the evidence. We need to package up our statutory interventions to be based on evidence and robust and post, 5 years. But we've got to build the scaffolding in the primary prevention space around what respect looks like, so that we're not continuing to pick up people after they fall over the cliff is often the metaphor that's used. I think the other challenge for me across the board in intervening with perpetrators is, what is the outcome we're looking for? Is the outcome about his change, reducing his recidivism? I would suggest that funders and others would want that. But what about her? Is it about her feeling safer? Is it about her making decisions that are based on reality, not his promises that he'll change if he has an intervention or a program? I don't think we've actually crafted that and navigated that well, or even articulated it well, because when I talk to people in the judiciary, I get the recidivism. Certainly from conversations with parts of government, that's where the focus is. But the nuance is in what we're doing to support her and what we're doing to support the children that are actually living with this experience. And whether we like it or not, if there's children and he's the father of the children, then there will be an ongoing connection into those children forever and a day. So somehow we've got to look at that nuance around what is our evidence that we're looking for.
I just want to thank both Vanessa and Fiona for their time this morning to give us an insight into, so not only practice on the ground, but an insight into how we think about men's behaviour and attitudinal change more broadly, particularly in the policy context, but also in how we fund these programs. So thank you very much, both of you, for your honesty and giving us, again, food for thought, but asking those questions, those hard questions with not very easy answers, they need to continually to be asked. So can I get you to thank Fiona and Vanessa for their time? Thank you. It gives me great joy now to introduce to you Regina Newchurch. So I've got to know Regina a little bit over the last couple of weeks, and I'm absolutely thrilled with the conversations we've had, Regina, and I just want to thank her for her time to come and speak from her perspective, who has also been immersed in narrative ideas and has worked both in CAMS and with Aboriginal families and communities using some of these ideas. So I think it's a real privilege that we get to hear from Regina from her practice perspective, and particularly from an Aboriginal practitioner's point of view about how we take these ideas up and use them. So thank you, Regina. And I also want to particularly thank Chris Dolman, who has also been a part of the team on this journey to do this research. And people will know Chris is a narrative therapist as well, and has worked with families, and particularly works with men who use violence. So for the next half hour, 40 minutes, we have the pleasure of having a conversation with Regina and Chris around their perspectives as practitioners and how they use these ideas in their work. So being able to see it on the ground and how these ideas are taken up is a real privilege. So I was wondering maybe, Chris, to get us started, from your perspective as a narrative therapist who have worked with men who use violence, do you want to share with us what you think are the particular strengths of this practice?
Sure, thanks Sarah, and hi everyone. I guess there's many different kind of angles to answer that question. Be thinking a bit about what these practices can offer. And I guess as a practitioner, and knowing there are a lot of practitioners in the room, I think I might start with that in a sense, that these practices can offer practitioners and agencies something. I think they can offer practitioners and agencies a way of working that is consistent, actually, with perhaps many of the values that practitioners brought with them into this field, social workers, counsellors, whoever. Because these practices do value, respectful, accountable, safe, non-pathologising ways of working, among others. I think practitioners and agencies don't have to kind of throw these values sort of out the door when they're working with men who use violence. That it's not as though they can hold on to these practices, or we have to hold on to these practices when we're working with everyone else, then somehow discard them when we're working with men who are hurting people they care about. But we can actually continue to hold on to these things that perhaps are important to us in our work, and that actually can be really sustaining for practitioners in our work. And that's what we all want, don't we, in services, to work, to be sustained and to contribute to other colleagues being sustained in this area of work as well. So I think that's one thing I think that these practices offer. And also think of, in Uniting Communities we get many phone calls from concerned women, actually, so mums or sisters often, or nanas, calling, inquiring about, so-called anger management courses for men in their lives, men that they know perhaps are hurting the partners. And, these women, are in no way condoning these actions, but are also, alongside of not condoning it, they're also, continuing, of course, to love and care for these men and wanting something different for them. And so I think these ways of working also offer them something as well, that they know that if, after all the hard work they've done, I'm not saying they should be the ones doing the hard work, doing the research, but after the research they do to try and find a service, that they can have a bit of a sense of that these guys that they're continuing to care for, whilst not condoning what they're doing, are going to be treated in a respectful, collaborative, non-pathologising way. So I think, I think that's something else that these practices offer. Let alone what they offer sort of the men, the women and the children who are very much immediately affected by the use of the man's use of violence. I think also, something that also comes to mind in terms of what these practices offer is like a really dedicated paying attention to, power relations. Paying attention to, and it makes sense, doesn't it? If we understand family violence to be occurring in a socio-political context of unequal power relations, it makes sense to be drawing on practices that pay attention to that, pay attention to the, the power relations that are obviously creating a context for the violence and abuse in the family to occur, in terms of a gendered analysis of violence. I guess also paying attention to the power relations that have kind of been present throughout the man in his life as well, because we know often that men who are accessing these services, have also had, experiences of as boys or young men of being, subjected to abuse or injustices or other outrageous acts, or both interpersonal abuse as well as the abuse that comes about through engaging in all of our systems and structures. And so I think these practices also provide a way where we can engage around what Michael White called the politics of experience, or what Alan Jenkins calls the politics of disadvantage, and have conversations with men about those things that doesn't diminish their responsibility for what they're doing and for the hurt they're causing, but also doesn't brush over those experiences either. And of course also these practices pay attention to the politics of practice, the power relations that are inherent in a therapeutic relationship as well. And I think provides practitioners with a way of working that is kind of it's not the very things we're trying to support the man to move away from. That it's not kind of coercive or controlling, or doing kind of in a broad term doing violence to that man. So I think there's many things that these practices can offer.
Thank you, Chris. I think your point about having an approach where practitioners can come together and talk about ideas can create kind of that sense of belonging or that collegiality. Having a shared language, a shared framework, can often do a lot for professional development, collegiality.
Yes.
And in this hard work, that's often needed. I also, Regina, you were drawn to narrative therapy. And so I was wondering if you want to share with us, why your journey, why you were drawn to narrative therapy, and what you might see as some of the strengths in terms of your work with Aboriginal families.
Yeah, I started the narrative when I worked for CAMS. It was part of a training for CAMS, and I wasn't sure of it at first, but got into narrative and felt this was the way to do it. My purpose for the narrative is to hear the story from the clients in a way that empowers them about strength they feel they may have lost, or if they've got a behaviour, is it a learned behaviour from growing up, is it a social norm? And then we sort of try and work through that. So we actually it just gives them the voice to tell their story, using the narrative and about their upbringing and how we can best support to bring back how it was once for them. So I take them back as far as I can, using the narrative.
Yeah. So why did stories, you're talking about stories. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that, Regina, and the importance of stories?
Yeah, working in the community, work with DV, grief and loss, suicidal ideation, with children and mums and all that. So we use it in a way that's, especially with the DV stuff, or if a female is putting up with that, it's a learned sort of thing because she watched her mother go through it, so it's like a social normal. Mum went through it, so it must be the way. Well, no, it's not. We ask them what their beliefs are, their norms. It doesn't fit to the relationship they're already in, so it's like, okay, well, we need to raise that up about your own beliefs and values and your worth, your self-worth. If it doesn't fit the relationship, then it's not okay. So, yes, it's a bit tricky. But we just sort of, we go back as far as we can and unpeel all that for them.
Also, Regina, you've shared with us what some of the reasons why you were drawn to narrative therapy. From your point of view, now working with Aboriginal families over time, is there anything that worries you about narrative therapy and using it in those contexts?
I think thinking that following the narrative by step 1 to step 2 to step 3 just doesn't work. Yeah. I know that for a fact. I've been condemned by kids and it's not a good thing. When they, why are you talking to us like that? And it's like, maybe I shouldn't use a narrative so quickly. Yeah, and they're like, we're not going to talk to you, auntie, you want to talk to us in that way. I was like, okay, it's fine. So I spent a whole lot of time changing the language of the narrative that fit the community. So that took me a long time to do, and I tried it once on someone who already had mental health issues, and she could have killed all of us in that room, and I was like, oh no. Then it was her damaging our name across the community, and we had elders ringing up, what are you doing? You got to come and speak to us and tell us what you're doing to this community. So from then on, we used to get permission from elders first to support it. So we were putting it out in an event for community that we're aware there is DV, we're aware that there is suicidal ideation, that there's young kids going unfed for however long and there's trouble in the family. So we create this big event and we let everybody else go first, because if we show up first, they know what we're there for. It's like, oh no, here comes the intervention team. So we stayed back until that event was in process. Then they'd be like, oh, now we know why we're here. It's like, well, you know, it's safe ground, it's home and to everyone. So that's how we would do it. And we would listen to all their stories and get them to listen to their grandmothers and their, you know, grandfathers, and how they may have forgotten over time about their worth or value. And it does change. Some may not change all, but we still keep going.
So you've often talked to me about the importance of events and gatherings, Regina, and so can you give us a little bit more insight about, you know, coming from a narrative point of view, how that might look differently? So how do you enable people to start telling their stories and the safety of that? Because it seems to be quite significant, those gatherings.
It does. We'll hold an event where we've got stuff up around DV and around kids feeling unsafe or whatever it may be, and we've got the stalls there so that people know why they're here. They're told in advance while we're there. Then I'll sort of just walk around and, you know, stand there and talk to someone, and they'll say, you know, you've got like 5-10 minutes. We're like, yeah, absolutely. We sit down and we'll say to them, how are you coping with all this? Because it's basically there, all the signs are there, what we're here for today, and then they'll start talking about it, and then we arrange appointments. Well, we can come down and see you at home. You know, we'll come visit you, and we'll make it a regular thing until we work through it. So it's about just opening up the doorway. That whether they step through or not, that's up to them. But we can still keep trying.
So engagement through community.
And it's letting them know that we're all aware of what's going on. So then they're a little bit more reluctant to do something. Maybe on the smaller communities, they're a bit more reluctant to do DV down there because it's known. So yeah, it's just putting it out there that we are aware, and we have elders' permission, so we're not just going to rock up without council permission. It's already, you know, put out there.
Excellent. Thank you, Regina. So, Chris, Regina's spoken a little bit about some of the strengths and kind of the practice principles that she's used. I just wanted to also maybe turn to you and ask for your reflections. You know, working in different contexts, you've particularly worked, you know, with men, you know, one-on-one or in groups who have used violence. You know, if you reflect on narrative therapy, what are some of the key ideas that, you know, you kind of hang on to or think important or influential in your practice?
I think some of the practice principles that have been spoken about today that you've gone through, as well as that Kate ran through with that exercise, I think they're a great place to start in terms of thinking a bit about the principles that might shape this work for practitioners and services here that are interested in kind of taking them on. So rather than kind of replicating that, I thought I might just give a small account of some work that I did with a man, just to sort of try and bring those more to the fore a bit.
Excellent.
I'm sharing this story because, one, this fellow has given me permission to share this publicly. Should I move that aside, perhaps? It's always a bit of a dilemma sharing work in front of people, like exposing work to people that aren't familiar with how I work overall. But I hope it gives you a bit of an idea, and also perhaps might strike a chord, even though your context might be different. Would perhaps strike a chord with you for your context a bit as well. Certainly at Uniting Communities, our family violence work is situated in a broader family relationships counselling team, where we meet with people around a whole range of different concerns. I hope I can still say we, even though I haven't worked there for 18 months. Is that all clear to say that? Thank you very much. And so, so we never quite know sort of what the concerns are that the person who we're about to meet with is kind of bringing into the room. And so this was certainly the case in meeting with James. Okay. Now, certainly one of the principles that Sarah and Kate have touched on today is around respectful collaboration. And I think it's interesting for us to think a bit about this and how we can even kind of create a context for collaboration with people before we even sort of meet with them. You know, how do we kind of describe our work and our roles in a way that kind of opens the door for collaborative work? that positions the person as being, as far more than the problems that they're facing, that they're bringing into the room with. How can we describe our work in a way that really acknowledges, from a narrative perspective, I guess, that lives are indeed multi-storied. And so also I think as part of establishing collaboration with a man who's using violence, who's hurting people he cares about, is really, for me, for our team, has often been so much about really wanting to begin to understand something about his situation and what he's concerned about, and also maybe even what he might be hoping for by coming along. Sometimes those hopes are really hard for him to describe, or it might just be to get out the door as quickly as possible. That's quite a strong hope that some men have at times as well. But still, there's something in that we can be working with as well. So I'm just, given the focus of this research has been around engagement, I'm just going to go through some inquiries, some aspects of the conversation I had with him in our first conversation. Not to say that engagement is all done and dusted in the first session, of course, but just to give you a bit of a sense, I think, of some of these principles. So, James is he's in his early 30s and lives with his female partner Melissa, and they have 2 preschool-aged children. They've been together for about 7 years. And so, I just began by asking him what's important to be sort of letting me know about, given the time we've got today. And he said that he told me how he gets stressed out at times. He gets stressed out, and he gets angry when things get too much. And so I asked him a few questions about this, and he said for over a year now he'd felt that things had gotten too much for him following the loss of a job and resulting financial pressure for his family. And he'd become quite ill with sleeplessness and ulcers that were affecting him as well. He said the financial pressures had eased just recently, but a few weeks ago, he said when he was feeling really crap, that's his words, he had an argument with Melissa, and then he took off in the car, okay? Had an argument and he took off in the car. And so, I guess, previously he'd kind of been bought into this idea that the stress was causing his anger, and so therefore, now that the financial stress had dissipated a bit, he was now left a bit miffed, I guess, as to how come he would still be arguing and taking off in the car after an argument with Melissa. So I really just asked him if he could help me understand a bit more about his experiences of feeling crap, and he said that at times he would think about the financial hole that his family was in on account of his work situation, and this would make him very unhappy with the way life was going. And he says it's as though I pull back from people altogether, he said. So I'm beginning to understand something a bit about his situation and his concerns. I asked him what he means by pulling back. He said, well, things like, among other things, being snappy with the kids, okay, and not talking to Melissa. So these are terms that we might sometimes hear that can sometimes be euphemisms for something else, can't they? Like being snappy. When he said about not talking for Melissa, I asked him a bit about the not talking, and he said, for the not talking to come to an end, it has to blow up and become horrible, and then I take off in the car. So again, I'm hearing all of these very general descriptions, aren't I, of being snappy with the kids and blowing up and taking off. So, but I'm not, I'm not wanting to impose any other kind of naming or tell him actually what's really going on here. I'm just staying with his naming of his experience at this stage. And, because he's in front of me, I'm interested in how this is for him. How is it for you, James, to be pulling back with his family? What's that like for you to be doing that? He said, well, I hate it. I said, I hate not wanting to be with the kids. He said, he went on to say they don't deserve it and Melissa doesn't deserve it either. And so, this is one of the principles that highlighted as well, just beginning to understand the effects of what he's doing. So far, I've just addressed really the effects on him at this stage. I feel that's kind of fair, actually, just to ask him firstly about where all this leaves him. My intention is to ask him about where it leaves the kids and how it affects his partner as well. But, I was interested in this, why he hates pulling back. This is kind of a bit interesting, isn't it? That if someone's pulling back and they're hating doing so, then this might get us onto some other conversations, other things about what's important to him. And so I asked him a bit about why does he hate this pulling back? What doesn't sit well with him about that? And he said, well, I want to be a good dad and husband, not a mongrel. He doesn't want to be a mongrel. He doesn't want to just shut them up all the time. So he's taking a position around what he's doing. He's declaring where he stands in relation to what he's doing. I'm not telling him he shouldn't be taking off or, you know, being snappy with the kids. He's actually taking a position around this. But he's told me he wants to be a good dad. So this is an opening into this thing, you know, known as, in some circles, as kind of ethics or relationship ethics or ethical strivings or, you know, in narrative practice, you know, what's important to him in terms of what he gives value to in his life or what he hopes for his life. So I said, when you say you're a good dad, James, you know, what do you mean? What sort of dad do you want to be? And so then we had a conversation a bit about the kind of father that he prefers to be, these ethics. You know, what he gives value to as a father, his preferred way of being a father. And it wasn't about pulling back or shutting up the kids or being snappy or shutting up Melissa. It was about things like being involved with his family, doing things with them. With his kids, it was about not wanting to miss out on them being little. Okay? He wants to be there for them when they grow up, you know. And so, you know, some other questions that we can ask about this, taking a curious approach and sort of this idea of, you know, storing people's experience. And I asked him, how does he want his children to remember him when they look back on this time of their life? And he says, well, he wants them to remember me being an involved dad, you know, being involved in what they did in their life. You know, I don't want them to remember being yelled at. So he's telling me more and more about what's going on, isn't he? As he's telling me about his preferences. I'm hearing two stories, really. What he prefers and what he's not so happy about with his life. But he's kind of declaring these. I'm not telling him. He said, and then he said, I don't want them being scared of me. Okay? I don't want them being scared of me. So, you know, these things don't just fall out the sky. We can be interested in the history of these things in men's life. And he said that, I asked him how long these things have been important to him. And he said, you know, had they been important for a long time or were they something more recent for him? And he said he probably thought they actually went back to his own childhood. There was a lot of conflict at home, he said. It wasn't abusive, but I remember feeling scared of my own parents, all the arguing, and I didn't like that. I asked him if this somehow shaped what was important to him in his own family, and he said, yes, don't get me wrong, my parents weren't bad, but I want something better for my own children. And we talk more about that. Again, I asked him some more questions about the kind of family he's hoping to create with his partner, and he gave me some more descriptions of that, including, you know, these terms are pretty available to people often, I guess, you know, wanting to feel safe and happy and loved and secure. I checked in with him because I think this is a part of collaborative practice to, at times, just check in and ask how the conversation's going. And he said, it's going all right, it's going okay, you know, I should have done something about this before now. And I asked him, so, you know, what happened a few weeks ago when you took off in the car? Was that somehow linked to sort of making this appointment today? And he said, he confirmed that it was. And I just asked him, is it okay if I ask a bit more about that day? And he said it was okay, but he told me a bit more how a simple argument had turned into a full-on argument, which then had him yelling loudly. Okay, so he's beginning to tell me more and more increasing details of what he's done. And he said that I said some shocking things to Melissa, and that he smashed a light switch as well. Okay. So it's interesting to think a bit about what we talked about previously, even in this conversation, that made it just a fraction more possible for him to begin to name some of these things that he'd done that he was not so proud of. Okay, you know, what had we talked about that provided a basis for him to actually be able to speak, to sort of look back on his life from a different perspective? And it wasn't just taking off in the car, it was burning off. He burnt off in the car, which I think sounds a quicker thing, I think. And that he stayed away for the rest of the day. Okay. Where had this left him, I asked. And he said, well, I was in a mess and I was upset. Okay, well, you know, so I asked him, you know, what was the upsetness in relation to? And he said, well, I feel like a total arsehole. Okay, so he's got these stories. He's not only a mongrel now, he's now an arsehole. Okay, so he's collecting these kind of identity conclusions. But I'm also hearing other things about what's important to him. He said, I hated myself for what I've done. I don't want to lose my family. And so I asked him, you know, what particularly have you done that makes you feel like an arsehole? I'm not calling him an arsehole. These are his words, of course. He said, well, for saying those things to Melissa, you know, it really upset her. He said, and the kids saw it, the kids heard it and they saw it. Okay, so we're starting to get, because I've asked a bit about where this has left him, we're also get on to a bit about where this has left his family as well, the effect of this on his family, which was my overarching intentions as well, of course. I think part of this accountable practice that's been talked about today already, among other things. I said, what do you think especially upset Melissa about this? And he said, just how mean I was, that I could even say the stuff I said. And again, it's so important that kids aren't invisible in this work, isn't it? So I asked him, how does he know the kids heard it? I'm not doubting him, but I'm wanting him to kind of step into his experience, but also step into their experience of that a bit. And he said, well, they're smart kids. And he said, the oldest one said to me, you made Mummy cry. Okay. So his daughter, who's only, in preschool, she was giving him some pretty important feedback, wasn't she? You sort of wonder what it might have even taken for her to say that. Probably shouldn't lose sight of that, actually, when we hear those kind of accounts from kids. What does it take for a child to say that to their father after seeing him be that way? Anyway, I said, how was it for you to hear her say that? And he said, it wasn't. He said other things, including it wasn't good, and he said it was an eye-opener. So the question, of course, is, what has his eyes been open to on account of his daughter saying this? He said, how it was for them. They'd been scared and upset. And that was also what prompted him to do something about it. Okay. He wants to do something about it. What is he hoping for by doing something about it? He's wanting to be able to, so he said things like he's wanting to be able to resolve arguments calmly, not hurt his family, not get out of control, and set a good example for my kids. Okay. So these all sound very reasonable things, don't they, for a fellow to be saying about what he's hoping for. But I was also wanting to ensure that, Melissa wasn't lost in all of this. And so, I said, what difference do you think it might make for Melissa for you to be doing something about it? And well, she'd be pleased. Why would she be pleased about this? This was kind of... I'm not sure he thought so much about this. He said, well, she wouldn't be so scared in talking to me. Again, I didn't want to brush over her experience, so I asked him questions like, how does James know that Melissa was scared to talk with him? How did he know that? So again, inviting him to sort of reach into her experience or his knowledge of her experience. I mean, these are only guesses. I'm asking him to make guesses. He doesn't really know, but asking him to make guesses. And he said, well, she said it, and I've noticed it, not talking or backing off, just going quiet when we've got having an argument. He said, I asked him other questions like, has he always seen Melissa's backing off in this way? He said, sort of, I think this can be quite significant because sometimes men talk about, their partner kind of backs off and those kind of descriptions are decontextualised. It's all about her backing off rather than actually seeing the backing off as an effect of a long history perhaps of control or violence or abuse that has her making a very reasonable decision to back off for her own safety or her kids' safety. What was it like for him to see her, backing off and not talking? He said, well, it makes me think that, the yelling and saying those things is almost as bad as hitting. What are you kind of seeing that has you saying that? And he said, well, maybe just things how things are for her. Not to be able to talk about things with me, wondering about how I might react. And, this is not what I'm wanting. Because it's kind of at the intersection, I guess, of these conversations about a man's ethics and his use of violence. As he's realising the effects of that on his partner, it's kind of there where something happens where he feels like he's an arsehole or a mongrel, or I guess in middle class speak we might call that kind of shame, I guess. And so this is what gives him this shame, this mongrel conclusions reflects all sorts of, or beginning to reflect sorts of understandings and awareness about how what he's been doing has been affecting people close to him. This is a very rushed account of an hour-long conversation, and it's I've edited lots out, of course. you know, at the end of the conversation, I just checked in with him how the conversation's been, what's standing out, and he said, "Oh, it's been okay," and I was happy with that. You know, it's been okay. I was kind of pleased. At least it'd been okay. I've had other feedback, not quite as kind of encouraging as that. And he said, "Oh, so what's been okay?" And he said, "Oh, well, just thinking things through." Yeah. And I said, "Oh, you know, so fairly dogged, I guess." So you know, why has that been okay to just be thinking things through? He said, "Oh, maybe just a bit clearer about some things, you know, how what I've done, you know, what it's been like for Melissa." Yeah, sort of trailed off then the conversation, and so, yeah, we didn't meet again, and there's lots more I could tell you about my work with James, but I hope that gives you a little bit of a sense of some of the principles that were sort of being talked about earlier and how they can be brought to life in our conversations with men. So,
thank you, Chris. I think, Regina, you've also shared with us already the way you've started to use narrative ideas, particularly with children. You use it with your community in community events. And so I just would welcome your reflections, Regina, about if you would feel like you want to tell a story about your practice and what went particularly well, or what you learned along the way trying to use these ideas when working with families.
I guess to start off with, I'm a counsellor first before narrative therapist.
Yes.
I will use my narrative therapy when it's there after I've assessed the client, if they're able to handle that narrative, because you're actually going back to a very traumatic time for them where the trauma sits with them, and you've got to unpack it and find out what that means. Now, I had a client who was around 12. Mum insisted that she wasn't listening, that she was out of control. This was through CAMS at the time. So I went out to visit Mum, had a yarn with the daughter, and she's like, "Mum's, you know, very strict and she doesn't get me," and the mum was afraid that they weren't communicating very well, and she said, "I'm very anxious around my daughter." And I said, "Oh, okay." So I got the daughter hooked up into a after-hours group at the school because I wanted her to sort of be doing something while I was talking with Mum, because I felt Mum was the one that needed help. So I asked her, has she ever felt this anxiety before, and who was she with at the time? And she said, "Well, with my oldest daughter." And I said, "Oh, okay, so tell me about your oldest daughter." She said, "Well, we were the same. We weren't getting along. I was very strict with her and whatnot." And she said, "I came home one day and found her hanging in the room." So it was that anxiousness of losing her daughter now and letting her go out. And so it was recognising that her anxiousness was coming from a grief and loss that she had experienced prior. So then we got her connected with her sister. They hadn't spoken in years. That was very difficult because I was getting abuse on both sides. "How dare you come in here trying to get me to talk to her?" And I said, "Look, it's about supporting through this process." So finally got them talking. That was to help because she was becoming dependent on my presence. And then I said, "Now you're going to have to sit down and talk to your daughter around your grief and loss." Mm-hmm. That way it's sort of shared and you're able to recognise when you feel anxious again what that might be. Mm. But we needed to connect it with something that she's experienced in her past that maybe hasn't been dealt with, basically.
I think you've brought up a really important point, Regina, and you and I have had conversations about this. So in terms of, you know, using stories or understanding people's, you know, pasts or their histories can often be quite traumatic. And so how you sit alongside someone to be able to do that. Do you want to share what that's been like for you to sit alongside and enable, you know, that storytelling for the purpose of healing?
Yeah, most of them will. I mean, I've sat beside young kids, you know, when they're talking about the shameness they feel when they talk about how their parents fight. Mm-hmm. Then I've sat with mums who, you know, talk about, you know, "I don't want the community knowing that this is what happens." Well, I explained to her that's kind of too late because that's why we have this intervention program, and how I work with mum around where she's used her strengths before, how she's actually utilised that and gotten through that situation before. How did you walk through that before? "Oh, this is what I've done." "Well, who was with you?" "Oh, I was with Nan." "Well, where's Nan now?" "Oh, she's down at Rowcombe." "Well, let's go visit her." Mm-hmm. So I'll identify her strengths about who she walked with in the past. So what she's dealing with today. as for the male, you know, it's about the kids. So we've got to talk about how the kids become the key to keeping them together. And it's like, yeah, you can't stay together and let the child be unstable and unsafe to go home. So it's about working with a child in the school, see what they're dealing with, and then taking it back and bringing the community in the know of what's happening and how we can work together. When you've got the whole community working together, everybody is stronger and they come and they feel more safer talking about it. Yeah. So, sitting alongside of them can be, for myself, it'll trigger something because they're my people. Yeah. Because their families, their mothers and grandmothers were high school kids with my mum. Mm-hmm. So that will trigger stuff for me, so I've got to learn how to hold myself back. Sometimes I'll have a cry with them and they'll be like, oh, you shouldn't be crying. But it's a way of coming in and looking not as a clinician, not as a therapist, as a person who's just there. Yeah. And then you've got to be very careful about attachment disorders, which we've gone through before. So it's about assessing how much they can handle of the narrative. So I don't often let them know I'm doing the narrative because they will disengage. Yeah.
Also, Regina, can I, if that's okay, can I ask you about the concept of shame? And so we, in narrative therapy, that is a practice principle that's been named. Mm-hmm. But you know, you and I have had a bit of a conversation about that and the use of the word shame in Aboriginal context. Do you want to say something about that? Yeah,
shame is already present in them. The minute we go down there and they know what we're there for, their heads are going to go straight down, so we know there's shame. We don't ever discuss it with them. We wait for them to bring it up. You know, shame when I saw you rock up. And it's like, yeah, I know, I saw the way you tilted your head there, and they'll laugh. So we'll turn a bit of a humour into it, and then we will talk about it. Only when they've opened the floor for it. If we do it for them, they're going to have they're going to come back at us and say, why are you sticking your nose in my business? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we are very careful. So I will stick with counselling first of what they're coming to me for at the time. Yeah. When they bring up something from the past, then I will start my narrative. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I
also just want to, before we finish up, is just give Regina a chance. She's often talked to me about her work with children, and you've done you know, Regina's talked to me about how she, as a narrative therapist, would reflect on her work with children and its applicability. And so you've done some creative stuff in that space, Regina. Do you want to tell us about it?
Yeah, I wrote a narrative journal, a book that I did through my diploma, and as I started writing, I only got about 20 pages, and I thought, this will be fine, this is just kids, you know, they're all right. Took it in there, and they were all so critical, and I was like, I walked out of there feeling really bad. I went back to CAMS, and I'm like, I think I need counselling. So those kids were awful to me. I said, I'm not going back there again. But they said it with smiles on their faces. That sucks, Arnie. I was like, okay. So what is it? Well, we're not babies. Take that out of there. And I'm like, okay. So I went through the whole. So after working with the kids over a period of time and learning to become thick skinned around them, my journal ended up being 60 pages long. Yeah. So it started working. So I was then using my whole team. The team of three we had were using those books, the narrative books, to work with kids, because it opened up each page, and you had it would be a 1 page per session, mm-hmm. and then we would work through it, and there would be drawings in between, and there would be highlights where they achieved, you know, some sort of thing that they felt they lacked. It may be like they might have been ashamed not to go into the next classroom, mm-hmm. or they might have been feeling anxious about something. So we work on each and every one of those emotions. I had got this little figure, and around it was little circles, so I'd ask, how was you feeling for the whole week? So they'd fill in the circles. I was sad, I was this. So I'd say, now roll it up into one ball and we'll give it one name. Every child used a swear word. You know, they wanted to call this little thing, you know, shit thing or stupid thing. And so I said, now we need to create what it looks like and what it's stopping you from doing. We're going to focus on that. So they would create a little model of some creature, and I'd say to them, leave it here with me and let me deal with that, what it's doing to you, and you go off to school and have a good week. And usually they would, because all their problems were left with me.
Yeah. So again, I'm a little bit aware of time, but again, I just wanted to thank Regina for your insight. Again, listening to practice is one of the great ways I think that we can learn and to share. And, for practitioners to share their stories about the challenges but the positives, you also open yourself up to be listened to. So can we just give both Chris and Regina a round of applause? We probably do have 5 minutes before what I want to do is wrap up today about some of the implications of the research, but also Kate wants to just feed back really briefly some of the thoughts that happened this morning around that case study. But before we do, so we just want to use the last 10 minutes to do that, but we might have a couple of minutes for questions. If anyone wants to ask Regina or Chris a particular question around their use of narrative and invitational ways of working. Anyone got any questions? Don't be shy, otherwise we'll move on. Excellent, thank you, Rachel.
This could be for both of you, I suppose. What have you found in your practice that would be the biggest or common blocker to moving forward?
Good question. The
Like
biggest
from
or
blocking the narrative, or blocking, sorry, that's me going into my own blocking out what? The narrative?
Moving forward.
Oh, and moving forward?
In the process.
Oh, geez. Could be a lot of things. It could be you've wrecked yourself with community. You might have said something and you've been told to leave. They're disengaging. Or simply that it's conflict of interest because it's too close to home. With myself, I've actually had to let clients go because I already know that because they lived down the road from me and I've been watching all the DV stuff, so it's how could I sit there and do counselling with it? It's like, don't lie to me, I was watching you the other night. So it's like I can't get involved. So anything around that, it's conflict of interest.
Yeah.
I won't get involved. So other than that, if it feels it's not working, then I will keep going until we're actually stopped by the people themselves and saying we don't want to see anymore. It's like, okay then.
I think, I was sort of taking up your question in terms of what might block men from moving forward, say, in my work with them. So, I appreciated Regina's reflections from her angle. I think that there's so many things, I guess, that can get in the way. I guess in some of the, I think one thing that I find particularly challenging in my practice in working with men is, because of our interest in the man's ethics or what's important to them in their relationships, sometimes these are pretty hard to get onto in conversations, I think I find it most difficult when the man is using violence towards his family in a context of other interpersonal violence in his life, where he's kind of, swimming in a lake of violence, I guess, in his life. And getting onto those, I guess for me it's about holding the position that a man does hold these values and ethics, actually. I start to be convinced that he doesn't. I start to be persuaded that perhaps they're not there in a way. And so how do we respond to this kind of dilemma, I guess? That's the next question. I think it might depend a bit on how we think a bit about these things that are important to men, these values or ethics. I guess if we think of them as somehow being internal to a man, sitting inside somewhere, then I think it's more easy to be convinced that they don't exist. Okay, but I think if we think of these values that are important to men, in terms of how they are as a father or partner, not existing inside them, but kind of, circulating in the air we breathe, that people can kind of draw on at different times in their life to shape their life. So, these ideas of, cultural stories or discourses that circulate that are about, relationships of mutuality and respect and care. They're out there. They're just harder for some men to grab hold of than others. And I think, Rachel Hare Muston, a feminist family therapist from a long time ago, said that the practitioner's room is a mirrored room. It only kind of reflects the discourses or ideas that the practitioner and the person bring into the room. And so I think as practitioners we can have a responsibility to bring different sort of understandings about masculinity or fathering or whatever into the room. And one way we've done that at Uniting Communities is we've had conversations in groups about what men give value to as a partner and a father. We document these, and we've made posters out of these kind of descriptions. And at different times, we've had these posters in the waiting room. Okay, and a lot of times, men would comment on these posters, where they read descriptions of other ways of being a father that kind of strike a chord with them. About being there for their kids or not wanting partners to be scared of them. And so we can use other men's words to kind of bring these ideas into the room, men that have faced similar circumstances. So I think, that's certainly a blocker, but I think there are also, there are ways forward for us, in relation to that as well. So thanks, Rachel.
That's a great question, Rachel. One more question, was there?
Yeah. I'm wondering what the role of recognising broader patriarchy and the trauma that imposes on men throughout their life is in this process. I'm wondering how you strike a balance between recognising that patriarchy is really damaging to women, but it's also really damaging to men in that there's certain feelings they're not allowed to feel, certain things they're not allowed to do. How do you balance recognising these broader systemic forces that have played a role in enabling these men to use violence, but not taking away the accountability of their actions? How do you strike that balance?
Yeah, sure.
You could also ask similarly, what has colonisation done to our Indigenous communities?
Shall I begin, and then, or do you want to begin?
Do you work with the men? I don't.
Okay, sure. So, really important question. I guess there's perhaps a couple of ways that kind of are possible in relation to that. As I mentioned earlier, that for some men they do have they have been living, or they do. We all live, I guess, with the effects of patriarchy in our life, and for some men this is experienced in terms of abuses or injustices that they've been subjected to as young people or as children. And so, how do we kind of pay attention to those whilst not diminishing the responsibility for what they are doing? And I think this is really a really interesting area of work, because it's important not to, because often men might use those stories from their life as being kind of justifications for their use of violence, or explanations for them, which are kind of end up being dead ends because they diminish responsibility. And so one way I think is actually to not be ignoring those, but actually be inviting men to be describing some of those experiences, but to be storing not just what was done to them, perhaps as a child or young person that was outrageous or unfair, not just hear about the abuse they were subjected to, but also about the kind of how they responded to that abuse as a child or young person as well, because it's in that response that actually speaks to other things about the man that's important to him. So I've had many conversations with men who have been subjected to abuse or other injustices as a child, and to hear stories of how they responded, actually, I can ask them questions a bit about not only what that took to do that, but what these responses reflect about what's important to them. And that perhaps, even as a kid, when they distracted their father from hurting their mother, they were actually, even then as a kid, taking a stand against violence, weren't they? I mean, this is what I'm thinking. I want to invite them into making, those kind of meanings, because if they're taking, so this history of taking a stand against violence might have been present as a child, but it's also present in the therapy room when they're rocking up for a conversation as well, or in the group program. And so actually taking a stand against violence, there's a history there. Not only is there a history of their use of violence, but a history of taking a stand against violence. And so we can be interested in both of those things. It's not to diminish the current use of violence. It's not to say that what they are subjected to is the same as what their partners experience. We can have those conversations without getting caught in that. But that's just one way that provides some options for us. But there are others as well.
No, I don't really work with men, but I have spoken to a couple of men around their DV because I knew them growing up, and I've learned. Well, they've agreed that they would rather be called participants in DV, which I changed the language for them. They were more comfortable to talk with me if I called them participants. and because I didn't like the word either, perpetrator. So yeah, and I've got a few stories from them. I'm actually working on a current DV cycle, cultural DV cycle, according to the men's responses to their violence towards women. So that's still working on that.
Really good questions. I'm just a little bit aware of time, so can we just give another round of applause for wonderful Regina and Chris, please?
Okay, I didn't expect to come up here again, and you didn't expect me to be up here again, but here we go. All right, so I've just worked through many pages of scrawled stuff, and so the kind of things that across the room were issues or things that you noticed or were curious about. The issue of trauma was a strong one, whether it be the man working with men's trauma or whether it be a women's ongoing trauma, was a strong theme. The importance of sitting with shame and the capacity to sort of allow that feeling to be, but also concerns about the potential implications of that if it were to result in further violence or self-harm, etc. A lot of people talked about how long this seemed to take. So that people were seeing men over a long period of time, and that was a substantial investment in a small number of men. But also, what about women and children's safety in the meantime? So the length of the work, the investment in terms of funding and resources, which is really counter to our current kind of climate, which is around quick solutions and, a group and fix them up. A lot of comments about complexities and how this might work for men with a whole lot of, other differences, so culture, religion, language, class, etc., but also comments around the women, the extent to which they carry blame and guilt and their ongoing trauma. So they were the kind of comments that came out. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you very much for your engagement in that exercise. So where to next? I just want to summarise by just giving some thoughts about some of the messages that we've heard today and end with some implications. And so I think from doing this project, invitational narrative ways of working engage men who use violence in their intimate relationships by being respectful, by being curious about and listening for ethical preferences and that readiness for change. Practitioners use then this platform to explore shame and the effects of men's violence on women and children. The acts of naming violence and abuse and articulating their effects on women and children are then used by practitioners to enable men to connect with more ethical principles of responsibility and accountability. It is this scaffolding that positions accountability as a political project for invitational narrative approaches, where gender analysis of power that privileges women's voices and centres women's safety is then actually made possible. So kind of in conclusion, we argued from doing this project that invitational narrative approaches are fitting for working with men who perpetrate domestic violence. However, it is an active, ongoing approach that actually requires time for slow, curious, considered work. And this work needs to be rich and it needs contextualised conversations. This responsiveness to contextualised needs and interests of men enables invitational narrative approaches then maybe to be possibly used with diverse cultures in diverse circumstances and with diverse communities. So hence maybe it does offer contributions to the field of perpetration intervention in Australia more widely. Crucial also is the enormous complexity of behaviour change in this context, embedded as it is in the gender normativity and the insidious micro-power relations of everyday life. This is nowhere more evident than when you hear the women's accounts in their lived experiences of men's attempts to change their behaviour. Here the women reveal the minutiae of change, the steps forward, the steps backwards. Perhaps more importantly, the glimpses that they provide of men's change drive home the point that there is no before or after violence, that change is neither linear nor seamless. It exists actually in moments. As highlighted in the findings of this study, men's violence does not constitute a set of behaviours that can be singled out and addressed. Rather, it infiltrates every aspect of their life and their sense of self. This is not to say that some men are irredeemably or are innately violent, but instead emphasises the work associated with creating and sustaining change. What invitational narrative offers in this space is the scope to stay with the work through this complexity, to produce bottom-up change, that is, changes that are both generated through men's perspectives and aspirations, but also situated in the messy complexities of their daily lives. Further, the invitational narrative emphasises on connecting up men's individual change with that societal and cultural change. It links the personal with the political, and it ensures the continued politicisation of not only domestic and family violence, but of inequality and social justice more generally. So my message is that we've also heard for the learnings that we got from practitioners and listening to men and women in this space, there are some implications if we are to think about how do you take this practice forward. And a very clear message that I've heard is that this work requires highly skilled practitioners to be able to engage in these ideas and to be able to use them over time to create that sustainable change. I think that there's also strong potential for the readiness to adapt these approaches to different intervention contexts because it is contextualised, so it does work from where men start. And also engaging with women provides valuable perspectives on men's progress as well as on women's and children's safety. And so if one is to pick up and adopt these ideas, you must centralise women and children's safety and keep them in the conversation as well. And so I think I might finish there. Thank you very much.